Hello. Good afternoon. I am Matt Suazo, a visiting assistant professor of English here at Kenyon, and it is my pleasure to welcome Ed Skoog to campus and to introduce him. Before I do that, I'd like to thank the Kenyon Review and the English Department for supporting his visit, particularly David Lynn and Catherine Weber and Janet McAdams for encouraging the invitation. Also like to thank Elizabeth Dark, others at the Kenyon Review who helped put this together, as well as Carla Parsons in the English Department for making things happen, on the ground once, Ed's feet were in Gambier. We were talking today. I've known Ed, we figured out, probably roughly 20 years, and most of that friendship and acquaintance has been more on sort of social footing. So it's been really nice today, as I said, to get to know the poet Ed Skoog. So we had a nice conversation, recorded a podcast, and just spent the day sort of getting to know each other in these guises that sort of otherworldly in some ways, considering our past. So Ed Skoog is the author of 3 books of poems, Mister Skylight, Rough Day, and Run the Red Lights, all published by Canyon Press, and a 4th book, Travelers Leaving for the City, is forthcoming in 2020, also from Copper Canyon. He's held fellowships from Loaf Writers Conference and the Lannan Foundation, and has been a visiting writer or writer in residence at George Washington University, Wichita State University, and the Richard Hugo House. His poems have appeared in Paris Review, Plowshares, Harper's, Poetry, New Republic, Tin House, and elsewhere. He is the contributing poetry editor of Electric Literature's Recommended Reading, and he currently lives in Portland, Oregon, and is co-host with novelist J. Robert Lennon of the literary podcast Lunchbox with Ed and John. He's also taught widely, and this is another reason why I thought he was an appropriate invitation. He's been teaching as long as I've known him. He's taught at the New Orleans Center for Creative Arts, Portland Community College, Portland State University, still has an ongoing summer gig at the Isle Wild Writers Week, and is also taught at the Attic Institute and 24 Pearl Street. I'd also mention he's a graduate of Kansas State University and earned an MFA at the University of Montana. So join me in welcoming Ed Skoog.
Thank you very much, Matt. Thank you all for being here, and Kenyon College, Kenyon Review, everybody for having me. Feel very welcome. It's a very welcoming place. Of course, I know it very well from all the biographies of all of the writers that I consumed, as well as their work. I haven't been here. The weather is exactly as it is in Portland, so I didn't have to change my mood to be here. Sometimes you have to kind of become somebody else, but this is, I have the wardrobe for this. This is good. I'd like to read some poems from my new book, which will come out next year. And it's called Travelers Leaving for the City. And like my second book, Rough Day, it's sort of a book-length poem and sort of individual poems without titles beyond just the first line. This sort of emanates from an incident, the murder of my grandfather in Pittsburgh in 1955, so long before I was around. And just my literal investigation of it, and my curiosity about the silence about it, because I didn't know about it until after my mother had passed away in 2004. I'm interested in just the ways that both the violence and the silence sort of affected the view of the world that I inherited and live in. And poetry and silence, poetry and memory, and poetry and absence. But one thing, Matt and I had a great conversation a little while ago for a podcast. We talked a lot about process. One thing I didn't come up with this is that I do not remember writing this book. I spent 2 years writing it. I can look on the calendar and I can show you the manuscripts. I keep things, carbon copies if you want to type with it. But I don't remember writing it. I grabbed the shirt off the hook on my way out into the night and bore it past the cathedral where a wedding was being swept up, and offered it to the man falling asleep against the embankment. He said it wasn't his shirt and waved me down the alley. The shirt made a face and wanted me to wear it. I said, maybe in the morning. Then as a rat chattered under the car, I set it on a piano and hurried back towards my own losses, keys alternating with the shadow, a white, of a parasite bird's hunger. And on the wind I heard the silkworms, a thread maker, a tailor, telling me that around the corner a horrible infant would be calling my name, and was, only it was the emptiness of generations, and a vine coming unglued from a downspout. So I had to remember suddenly the password that lets and lets and lets until there is no more permission. Silhouette imprecisely blesses each footstep with light rain. But there is another thing. I went down to the rhododendron field because, leaving for the city, she heard the pots and pans. There is a way of being alone, ghosts know, a trick to ignore what you're aware of. Rowing out Dawn's fishing boat into recombinant weather, or rowing in with the tide back to shore. There was a lot of weird stuff in my pockets yesterday. Now where is it? What shadow turns away this long but probably simple idea of a pulled-to shape like a photo transfer, a design that will accompany us, a t-shirt logo, speaks to a freshening of some other lugged-around consciousness, heavy in summer, and although handle feel lighter when weight shift to other hand, it is the same weight, even steam rising from a ring of water. Her iced tea leaves on the deck chair. She said she took a train. I suppose she did, her seat flensed and wicked, fabric coming apart like a coconut shell. Sitting up to half asleep past country, smoke, and factory yards, she moves through city toward him like a product sent away for, its weight side shifting in the hold. She took a cloud. I suppose I took cloudiness, and fix up my own apartment with borrowed money, break toy box into liquor cabinet, crack sunlight, and you'll come over and drink steeped tea in soft chairs while tallow burns the kitchen window. To frame approaches, and midway through sleep, hear the mouse addressing itself to doorway, fix it all up. With bartered time and roast chicken in wine you'll have already brought 2 springs ago with rosemary sprigs, one for the chicken, one kept in the shallow of a water glass on a side table. I will be the one who hasn't forgotten the fixing up with buttressed repasts, apartments as treatises on finding one's corner, the overhearing. Pittsburgh isn't there anymore. Rode by it on the gray horse, and instead a place where they go sick, a place of only mist. To properly understand the 12 Pittsburghs of the heart, but nothing to grasp or die for, and when the adults told me to cry, I sang on the uneven riser which swirls like northern lights in the ear. In 1955, my mother's father, a steel worker, was shot and killed in his hotel, intervening in an attempted abduction. The shooter crazed and lovesick, according to his mother. My mother only met him a few times. The last time, shortly before the murder, she said she took a train. In the testimony of another tenant, his face, after staggering out of the apartment, had an iron color. He fell into her arms. I was holding him, trying to help, she said, but he was dead. The kidnapper escaped with his ex, and they drove the outskirts of Pittsburgh, Tarentum, Aspinwall, Turtle Creek, all night before she talked him into turning himself in at dawn, turning into himself. Clouds are in a composition useful to spill space around the invisible. In moonlight, the murderer and the owl who buries and the bull who rings drove rural Allegheny County, stopped at midnight for hot dogs and milk, according to the transcript of the trial, heard the luminous processes of the dashboard. I suppose he sang, like a scarf gone out, long behind, like magnetism, like thorn bushes, like wind around a highway sign. He went up and asked if anyone was dead again. Why they have to assert themselves, even after we told them about sorrow. Think my grandfather's ghost rode alongside them the 11 miles, peering in to the car before departing. Who wasn't with him the night he was killed? Like hearing a stranger's headphones in the spirit of canceled flight and a storm coming. She missed the beard he was growing. We put our gods in clouds. We hide in clouds. So those are the first few poems of it. You might be able to hear there's a kind of form to it. I'll read another one from it, and then I'll go back in time to it. Where does the starting happen at? In the space before the unbeginning scroll, before the set of disagreements, language of the shootout, which is language's unscrolling. Nothing specifically human about the heartbeat, a crumbling wall. They are there, agents of the figure, or a summer airing, and having just arrived, afternoon, they put away their light duffels in the rooms. They talk about the labor of dinner, divide into pleasant domains, the onion chopping, corner swept bed maker. Following an idea long clapped and retrieved, long walk around a pond, a bleak dead eye of when memory will falter, dusk between leaves, a breaking into the eye, the way backs, one-eyed and unstoppable. I have known annihilating desire, and ripped gently apart like a thing with gears, with last felt duty, and blazed, and I have stayed quietly with bliss of supper and play on the carpet before bed, and I have tried to make sense and make meaning and make money and masks. I have deer on my side, and instead of hunting and the rolling of dice, instead of their enumeration. A painted bell, a portrait that rings, and watched the scroll in museum light, static and coursing. Watched day develop all in one person, the many-personed self. Heat in the shade, the long sentence. Waiting for the doors of the granary to open, dragonflies by the pond. The garden and the wild rough drawings behind it. And I'm working my way towards dying in my own surround sound increments. Farmers at the water wheel, the massiveness of the farm in their shoulders, angle of the bucket, the weight of the cooperage. That's where the beginning, spilled droplets in moth-littered dust. Even before we met, we never got over each other. Over you and the composite blue, composite blue. Winter does, when we are together, things. All at once the congregation gives up, sells the bell, sells the sleds, the shale and the shadows of the shale, leaves you, walking from the chapel to the train, livid with sleeping bags and wet couches. We never got over each other in person. Past the forms and the farms, past quarry and query, the moon's flesh and the rivers an ink stain. Under the bridge they step out again, argue with the pallbearers and the brides, the birdseed and bindweed. They stop for milk around midnight and get me some hot dogs too while you're in there. I'm not going in. Where am I suddenly? Oh, the land of the dead, pardon me, I didn't realize it. And the letters they said aren't going to be delivered, are they? I had thought the audience for these moments was an ear, like my mother's ear. But now I see the slip. Have these gallons been a trap? Galleons, sailing from the right edge of the drawn world. I guess that's the end of the book. That's so now that the butler did it and had been doing it and be continuing to do it. I was talking with Matt on the podcast about the quarrel between Denise Levertov and Robert Duncan about what is the poet's role in a dynamic time. In their case, the Vietnam War, which Denise Levertov was, very active in protests in the anti-war movement, and Duncan was not. And Duncan would, in their correspondence, which everyone should read, admonished Levertov for her activism. And she said, some form of you go to hell. Which, for a kind of hermetic spiritualist, is a whole different conversation. But Duncan said, well, and this is one of the letters, the role of the poet is not to combat evil, but to imagine it. Which I don't entirely agree with, but I think is interesting, and led to a number of poems. This is one of them. It's a little longer. This may or may not be in the next book. You remember the Oklahoma City bombing? I know some of you do. Some of you may have read about it. It happened before some of you were born. But it happened nonetheless. And that's kind of my neck of the woods, really. Timothy McVeigh at the Dreamland Motel. You must tear yourself up entering room 25. The way children were torn apart, blasted in the daycare. And it seems I must say it over and over to myself that he intended to. That he intended to kill children. And to not see the killing. And took pains to avoid being hurt himself. Himself, who was once a child and got away. As one survivor tells how pinned beneath concrete so tight she couldn't spit out her gum, she held an unseen hand that had been disconnected, and although the detail is grotesque, she said it was still part of the real person. And I am holding your hand into the smoke, to be changed by event, holding my own child's hand at crosswalks, in parking lots, in public places, where danger is disorder, a break in the pattern that conceals us like a snail in its shell. Which delicacy is strongest, slug or snail? A metal slug is a round bullet. It spins like a planet, bringing the morning Timothy McVeigh rose and slept, just like you and me. And if there is a soul, had a soul, and if there is no soul, had no soul. And so it is with you who doesn't want to be hearing about Timothy McVeigh any more than I want to be talking about him. But there he is, striding towards the getaway car the moment there is a blast. And don't you feel the waves pushed at you in that sunlight, how it cleaved to the day? He only got so far without license plates, pulled over for the infraction and caught. When enthusiasts talk about freedom of the road, that distance, his distance, is part of it. The highway miles, he was nobody. Like the midnight roads the murderer of my grandfather rode, you're hearing that a lot, before turning himself into police. You may be allowed to tear yourself up, like a ticket, entering the world of bombers, the explosive avenues and rigged doors, and want to turn for peace to beauty or a badge, that you might be known for your goodness. Bless the dead. He registered for the room as Bob Kling, but tore it up and put down his real name. He talked the manager down to $28 a night instead of 30. The Ryder van may or may not have been parked there. Still, it is uncertain what happened, in what order, as often is the case when the sluggish estuary of language washes into memory's current. My real name is Ed Skoog, but I dreamed a secret name, which is a window with a window beside it, inside it, and a ladder and a ball, and two arms reaching. And because I drew it once and tore it up and threw it in the fire, I tear myself up when entering a room with a poem in it, because a poem is meaning. And whenever you pay your $20 and step into the 25th room, there is a poem on the table, which is too horrible to read, and you read it. The 168 names, the words for their lives. I have seen them, their photos, on a grid, but in the room, I lie down on the carpet and dream them also. They are dreaming, and wake up, shower their bodies, which certain traditions say are the vessels for the soul. And they brush their teeth with assorted toothbrush styles, the toothpaste brands they have come to prefer. They shave, they comb, they protest the comb. They go downstairs and have breakfast. They run to the bus without breakfasts. Their lunches are packed. They are planning to go to lunch. They are government workers. They work for the government. They are the children of workers. The children are learning new words each day. In Junction City, Kansas, the voices are waking too. The clerks and the neighbors, the owner's son who tells the driver of the yellow bomb he can't park it next to the swimming pool, only by the sign. The taxi driver who said he didn't give the guy a ride and then okay, he did. The bomber peeled back the plastic of his ID and burned the paper. And the next day showed it to arresting officers. He ate a fruit pie. He is throwing the wrapper straight on the ground. They are weighing buckets of nitromethane on a bathroom scale out by the lake. They are slitting open the ammonium nitrate. They are pouring fuel into barrels. I am mixing the racing fuel, white fertilizer pellets turning bright pink, and I seal them up. I affix the blasting cap, connect the long fuse. I do this every day. I wash my face, I brush my teeth. I wash my hair with anti-dandruff shampoo. I cleanse myself before stepping into the day and coax my son down to breakfast. I am pouring cereal. I am pouring milk. We talk about what dreams we had. The Dreamland Motel has been raised. Its iconic sign installed at the museum in Oklahoma City, brought inside to light a room with its neon star, its Vegas lettering. The movable letters read, "Welcome." The bombing fell at Easter. He was executed a little after another Lent with intravenous drugs. Then one part became president and won the fight against it. The same is day that covers the memorial, bright from lack, semi-polar, uncovered and bludgeoned, bloodless and bowed. It was bullshit that drove him to do it, and the same nobility he claimed to feel is inside the language now, the language I'm using. The sentence has a fuse. You must tear up a poem that you enter, and the sound of the tearing rhymes with allowance and defeat. He had a poem read at his killing, one that has given comfort to many. He was comforted by a poem. Torn and burned, drowned, thrown far, the bombing victims worked for the government of the United States. They died working for it. And nowadays, half the time, I want to give up and say deal's off. The thick mire slog to be is too slabbed to brain. Asleep in room 25. The highway loud and the bombing practice at the fort nearby, tender in lullaby thunder. The pillow thin, and spring's menthol drifts to the open window, prairie insects legging the screen, lacewing, blister beetle, medicine moth, flesh fly, bombardier beetle, and the false bombardier beetle, which has no bomb. And when I wake, may still be there, the terrible truck outside. And even then, and this is what facing the ghosts tells the dreamer, what the false bomber sings to its cousin. I may walk into the hour keyless, into that last minute, may step away towards the cowardice of love. That was longer. This is short. Memo. There is a bag of candy in the office. Please help yourself. Please help out. Help the whales. There is a whale in the office. Please candy it yourself. Please yourself in the office, in a bag. All offices are candies. One of the whales is lying. A little shorter. So this is the most recent book. Covers this painter who lived in New Orleans, Noel Roquemore. Did you ever encounter Noel Roquemore at the auction house? It's kind of French Quarter Bohemia, 60s and 70s. Strange painter. They did a retrospective at the New Orleans Art Museum where I used to work when I worked there. And I have a sentimentality towards whatever exhibitions were there during the 2 years I worked there. This was one. And I wanted something of his on the cover, and this is it. It's a weird dude. I'll read 2 poems from this book. That should be it, because they're a couple pages long. So I worked at this art museum. I have no art training. Speaks something to the labor pool of New Orleans when I got there, that I was hired. I had been working at Microsoft for a couple years, again, without any qualifications, except for being young and having a degree. And they were impressed by that because hardly anybody even used email in 1998. And so I was running the website, which I didn't know how to do. But they didn't know how to look at, so problem solved itself. Paintings and drawings. I don't know how to look at art. Others regard an object privately, as in a changing room. But there's a certain kind of terror I'm trying to outgrow or live beyond. So I apologize for not inviting my boss at the New Orleans Museum of Art, Jacqueline L. Sullivan, to my wedding years ago. Allowing us to use the Grand Hall for free should have earned her at least a folding chair in any row. Last believer in dignity in the last city to know its texture, she barely paid and made men wear suits which in Gulf haze felt like mops. I loved her, and she was a bully. We all confused her with our mothers. And I was just one more wrong hire among dot matrix and file drawers rolling their meditations. On Mondays, the museum closed to the public, and I walked the galleries like a trustee, past one of Picasso's 400 portraits of his young wife, Jacqueline, and Degas' portrait of his sister-in-law, Estelle Mousson-Degas, arranging tropical flowers at a table in the family house on Esplanade, a few blocks away. When he visited New Orleans, Degas spent his time not painting at the fairgrounds racecourse, betting his cotton money on the local horses. At lunch, I'd walk there too, make a few bets and eat a bowl of white beans and rice, the best in town. I was not painting either. Maybe I'd jot down notes towards poems in the margins of the daily racing form, up in the press booth where Marcus and Bob covered the races, sitting with the stewards, former jockeys who watched the races for improprieties, although they could no better than Estelle through cigarette smoke and their stories see it. I remember Bill Hartack, who rode and won the Kentucky Derby 5 times, inquiring about fishing in places I'd lived, and then the next time asking again. They gave me tips that never brought any money, never brought the money I wanted. It's hard to predict the future. Going back to work, I'd see the maintenance staff drinking beer on the banks of Bayou St. John. If at night my coworkers climbed into frames of their own portraits, my love for them would be confirmed. The security chief smelled like lemons and slept in his office, suffered through board meetings with a coffee cup of gin. I dealt with board members, uptown types, whose seersuckered white supremacy smelled of gardenia, jasmine, and rot. The owly director wore red frames, and when he broke a netsuke said, "Well, better me than you," while elderly docents licked envelopes beside the coffee machine. All of us thralled in fear and desire to Jackie's attention. When the city flooded, the museum became an island. Gone by then, I read about it in the New York Times, how Jackie stayed with 3 building engineers, 2 security guards, 2 maintenance workers, and a secretary, and their families until the soldiers forced them out. Guns trump art when the guns are pulled. And here's the ennobling emblem, which makes me ache against her absence at my wedding. How she returned to the museum, commandeered some boat at the edge, and stood at the prow, past bodies through the unreceding waters. This is another New Orleans and mother poem, the things that I write about. My mother and the city that became my mother. Run the red lights, which is the title of the book. Which was the poem I'll tell you, but I'll just tell you in advance, were the last words of the singer Alex Chilton from Big Star, the Box Tops. Run the red lights. When my mother sent me for cigarettes, I'd buy a candy bar too, sign her name to the book and walk out with the green and white carton, Virginia Slims 100s, under my arm, the chocolate already gone. Sugar, my God. Like newspaper cartoon panels spread out on the kitchen table where I'd pretend to smoke, imitating her. After the corner store closed, we made our groceries at Dillon's, joined the impersonal. A villain snatched her purse there when I was away at college. And on the phone, she told me excitedly how Topeka police had chased the culprit. And she named each street, each intersection and landmark, the whole adventure, just for her. I'm grateful now to that sedentary house, although I've grown as large on candy as John Candy. My older brothers left home and our meals stayed the same, a skillet high with beef stroganoff, pot roast and broth, chili con carne, cheese sandwiches with mayo, flocks of fried chicken. Then the whole house went on a diet of cold tofu cubes, a broken disc of lemon in a water glass, cottage cheese measured out onto lettuce. And then back to London broil the next night, no questions asked. Lovely. We were emotions without form, and I carry it with me, not just in frame, arm, and jowl, and belly, but here in this intergalactic space of written thought, the infinite stage, where we come to talk to each other. Sugar makes me curious. After Katrina, I took the diet where you eat meat and lost almost 100 pounds from a surfeit of bacon, sauteed pork medallions, beef and lamb. The weight fell away like a knight's armor after a joust. I bought shirts at a regular store. I played softball and ran bases, bounded them as if on a new, more forgiving planet. And I went crazy, and I evened out, broke down again, inconsolable at the finale of 6 Feet Under. Tears from my mother, postponed, and all the more torrented for the delay. Opening the book of grief requires you read all the way to the end every time. Driving to work, I stopped bewildered at a gas station, paid cash for 2 Snickers bars that provided more salvation than I have ever known from religion's acres. I write about the West and the South and home, their tenderness and trouble and the weird spirits that break the best days. And still I find myself down by the river at twilight. On the bridge, deliberate-seeming people walk by like victorious aliens, past the consequential palaces lit as before, their faces turning in their rotisseries. In profile, my mother looked like Alex Chilton, lead singer of the Box Tops, and then Big Star. I used to see Chilton around New Orleans, in line at the grocery store, walking down Esplanade. My mother also had a solo career, playing solitaire and watching her own TV in the kitchen and then dying before everybody else. Dying, Chilton urged his wife to run the red lights, his last words. And when I had to leave my mother in the hospital, that was hard. And then again at the funeral, I set a marble under her folded hands. Don't know why. It's been 10 years, 10 fingers, the closed eye of each knuckle, each nail, its year's fullest day moon. Which of us shed the other? My scar from opening a window, such force to move the wood frame, so little to shatter glass it held. To be held so again. 10 years, so 40 seasons, 80 endings and beginnings. Well, always a gust in them, which is the sigh of how she would note leaf and bird. One hand to hold the coffee cup, one the cigarette, the red ember she became at midnight, red light, I. I think that's maybe all the poems that you need to hear to get a sense of what I'm doing. Maybe a few more than is necessary. But thank you very much for having me. Does anybody have any questions, commentary, critique, accusations?
A lot of the narratives for your poems seem to move sort of by association or wordplay, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you decide to move them and where.
Partly because they tell stories, I don't think of them as narrative, and so I'll tell a bit of a story until I think of something else. So it's largely by just kind of intuition, kind of when the leap offers itself, I take it, usually. Happy to abandon the story midway through. Anecdotes, really. I don't set out to tell a story, but I just sort of think that way, and there's so much I want to tell you.
Do you consider the humor ahead of time, or does that come as you're writing it?
You think these are funny? Am I a clown to you? It's a good question. I don't set out for them to be humorous. Well, they are a little humorous. Some of them more so than others. I'm suspicious and critical of myself when anybody sounds too profound, and so it's a way of trying to put an end to that. I think I've changed as a poet in that when I was younger, I would go for the joke. And I don't think poems should go for the joke because cleverness cuts off so many things, and jokiness. And jokes are not poems. Poems are not jokes. But I love jokes, and I love funniness so much. And I think language is funny, and I think people are funny, and our bodies are funny, and our stories are funny. So it gets in there. Yeah.
You told me just before your reading that the girl on the cover of Rough Day is your mother.
That's my mother.
With her pet crow, which she named for her father.
Yeah.
I mean, I want to know so much more about that.
Yeah, me too.
Can you tell us what it's doing there on the cover of your book?
Well, I mean, so after my mom passed away at a reasonable age, I was just too young for it. One is always too young for it. Just going through boxes of things, I found this great picture of her, which I'd never seen of her as a little girl in Aspinwall, Pennsylvania, probably 1939, with her pet crow that I know, she talked about the pet crow, I'd never seen a picture of it. And I know that she had named it after her father, my grandmother had divorced when she was 1, and she didn't really have a relationship with. So that's interesting. And you don't see that many pet crows. They don't really want to be pets, and I think this one eventually flew away. But in that same box of things, that same box, it was like the box of things I hadn't seen, is where I found the newspaper clippings that sort of disclosed what had happened to her father, because it was not known that he'd been murdered. I knew I had a different grandfather who was wonderful. And I knew that she had had a biological father, and I knew that he had died. And that was all that we were permitted to know.
But he wasn't dead at the moment of this photo.
No, this was 39,
Right,
and
you
he
said
died in
he died
55.
in 55.
Yeah. And it's been hard to find much out about it. Most of the information I have really is from newspaper accounts from the murder, which was kind of lurid and big local news for a few months in Pittsburgh, a city that I've never visited. It sounds like a dangerous place to me. That poem's coming out of the New Yorker, which is okay with me. Except it kind of begs the question of what relationship do I have to Pittsburgh, and it's none, really.
In thinking about the work that you're sort of doing right now, right, on Pittsburgh and sort of that book, the poem itself, did you think about the form as well, Lon? Like, how it might have changed did you ever consider, for example, writing it as an essay, right? Like, or even just in sort of thinking about poetry also, what are the kind of other forms you might have?
Well, it's a perceptive question, because I tried many other ways of writing about it. I think as early as like when I first found out about it in 2004 or so. The death of my mother and Katrina happened about the same time, and kind of the same emotional space, and then finding about this, everything's kind of intertwined. So I tried to write I thought, this might be interesting to explore in a nonfiction way, write an essay about whether, what actually happened, or the process, the feeling of what it felt like to find out about it. And I tried that. I'm not very good at prose. I tried to write a novel about it. Really bad at writing fiction. I struggled and wrote hundreds of pages about it. And then, 4 or 5 years ago, I remembered that the main thing I do is poetry, and that if I could write a poem about it, then maybe that would scratch my itch. And that poem became kind of this series of other thoughts and impressions and experiences that I don't really understand the process of. To quote Duncan again, Duncan said, "I don't use language, I cooperate with it." And I feel in the creation of this text, I cooperated more with the language than I had before. Duncan, who ultimately didn't, although kind of raised as a kind of spiritualist, Kabbalist, and all that, in his writing about things, he kind of concludes that it's all metaphorical, and that when he talks about kind of cooperating with language, he's saying he's sort of standing in for kind of writing with the spirits, right? And I feel like I collaborated in some way with my grandfather on this, in a way that I really believe is just cooperating with the language, which we all shared. But also, I don't know for certain if that's the case.
Can I ask a question about process?
Mm-hmm.
Do you tend to write these things straight through? Do you tend to write fragments and then put them together? Is it a combination of both? How do you go about it?
that changes a cadence to that. Rough Day and the next book were largely written in fragments and passages that, with some sense of some kind of formal principle that that end up appending to each other. And my first book and my third book, Run the Red Lights and Mister Skylight, were more discrete experiences. I want to write a poem with this title. I want write a poem about this person, about this moment. And they're very different feelings. They're very different genres, I think. I feel different in writing them. But I don't feel like I have much of a choice. And sometimes I have to work one way, and sometimes I have to work another way.
What interests, besides literature, do you find useful in writing a poem?
Well, I think a poet or a writer should have some other things that they do. It's good to have a job, and they're good at that. But something else creative. I play banjo and piano and other music things. But my musical life is important to me, important to my mind. Has helped me develop as a writer, and it's also given me an opportunity to not be a writer and still be engaging my imagination